Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. It's been a while since I've done a review, so let's get back to business by looking at yet another sequel, specifically Chrono Cross. If you had asked me about this game's predecessor a year ago, I wouldn't have been able to tell you much. All I knew was that it was some kind of JRPG that was well regarded for reasons that I really couldn't pin down, and was therefore really nervous about covering it. Thankfully for me, it turned out to be a really great game, as it managed to consistently catch me by surprise and keep me engaged by pretty much any metric you can think of. That meant when I found out that it had a sequel, I was really excited, because if it was anything like its predecessor, I was in for a fun time. However, that excitement quickly turned to concern, because it seems the development team wanted to shake things up with this one. And then they ended up shaking it so hard that they took a look at what they were building and decided to shorten the list of things to change to literally everything. New graphic style, new characters, a completely different part of the world, and a different console that will allow you to be far more brazen with adult subject matter. What could possibly go wrong? Apart from the fact that you're trying to follow up one of the most well-regarded JRPGs of its day and are doing so by trying to be completely different. So yeah, because of that, there's been a fair amount of discussion around this game, not only as to whether it's a worthy sequel to Chrono Trigger, but even whether it's a good video game to begin with. Still, after replaying Chrono Trigger with my brother on the DS, which introduced elements that tie into Chrono Cross, I had to see for myself exactly what the big deal was. So without further ado, let's see whether it was worth checking out. Since the gameplay has seen the most changes from its predecessor, let's start there. The core gameplay loop is a turn-based strategy game, but there are a lot of moving pieces that are fairly easy to figure out once you're actually playing it, but can be difficult to explain. For one thing, there isn't a strict turn order, as each character instead has a stamina bar that helps dictate what a character can do. Standard attacks are broken into light, medium, and heavy strikes, with heavier attacks consuming more stamina and dealing more damage, but having a greater likelihood of missing. However, whenever a character does land a hit, their chance of landing another hit goes up a little bit, which encourages you to chain multiple attacks together in a sequence. These standard attacks are essential because, in order to use abilities, referred to as elements, you have to land a number of hits corresponding to that element's slotted level. And yes, I say slotted, because apart from a small selection of unique techniques, you have complete control over the abilities that a character uses in battle. However, if having to build up power for elements wasn't enough to mitigate how much they're used, there are a couple of other restrictions. Not only are consumable elements that function like potions thrown in alongside your permanent elements, once any element has been used for a given fight, you can't use it again until the next one. Also, while using an element replenishes the same amount of stamina as a standard light attack, it consumes 7 stamina points for the character using it, an amount which can lead to negative stamina that has to be built back up. And if that isn't complicated enough for you, you also have the elemental part to keep track of. Each element belongs to one of 6 types, light and dark, fire and water, and nature versus other nature, or however the hell they explained it in-game. I think one of them's supposed to represent life and another the earth, but point being they're meant to counterbalance each other. Along with every element fitting into one of these 6 categories, each character is also innately attuned to a single element, which gives everyone both a built-in strength and weakness. And if that isn't complicated enough for you, there's also the field effects, because apparently elements don't know when to quit and have to stick around a little bit after you've used them. The short version is that if a color is showing up here, then that element type is more powerful, as are the characters attuned with it, with the opposing element being predictably weaker. Okay, I think I'm allowed to breathe now. Got through that part, now I have to just say whether it's garbage or not. So, when push comes to shove, you know what? I'm gonna take a page from this game and say that it's complicated. In principle, I think it's fairly solid. It's not the active combat mode that I liked from the original, but it does still have that same sense of tension, of every move you make mattering, which I'm really grateful for. Instead of managing time, it's a matter of managing how many spells you have left, judging whether you want to use your heavy hitters now to try and hurry things up, or if you want to hold them in reserve and try to set up a better opportunity. Because they refrain from showing you the enemy's health bar, it means you're constantly having to ensure that everyone is still okay, as you never really know for certain how long a fight will actually take. Granted, you get a small hint when they get low, as every character has a tired look to them when their health drops below a certain threshold, but even then, for creatures with a high health pool, it isn't always a good indicator, and can add some tension in and of itself as you realize just how close you are to getting past a given fight. Instead of managing time, it's a matter of managing how many spells you have left, judging whether you want to use your heavy hitters now to try and hurry things up, or whether you want to hold them in reserve to try and set up a better opportunity. On top of that, it also seems like the developers were trying to mitigate the issues that are to some extent built into the JRPG genre as a whole. For my part, I've tended to steer clear of the genre because of two aspects in particular. The first one of these is the grind that's often required, as by my understanding, it's sometimes necessary to power up a given team before taking on the next boss, which might end up slowing the game down to a crawl in the meantime. In order to address the issue, they decided to sidestep the problem by locking stat progression behind boss fights. After every battle you'll gain small health boosts, up until a final upgrade which can give a few other things like magic defense, attack power, and so on. However, those stat increases are eventually cut off until you get past those key fights, meaning that the developers have a much better sense as to what your power level is, and can therefore make the game balance a lot tighter. And tighten the balance they did, though I do wish the generic encounters were a little more difficult, as it eventually got to the point where I was sleepwalking through them, but more on that later. However, they might have sidestepped the issue in terms of character stats, but then they seemingly reintroduced the problem by throwing the reward system out of whack. Whenever you defeat an opponent, you not only have the chance to gain stat boosts, but also gain what are called spoils. Some of these are elements, which I have no problem with, but some of these are scraps and supplies that are needed in order to get more powerful items. In principle, I don't have a problem with crafting systems like this, but the means by which to get certain materials is left up to player discovery. It's hard to know what you're going to need for a given character's weapon, armor, or certain accessory items, which leads to it being an annoying obstruction rather than a rewarding system. As a result of the mere possibility that I might need something down the road, there were multiple times where I started a fight because I felt I had to on the off chance that I might get something that I needed, even though I knew there was no direct reward to offset the cost. And that's assuming I even wanted to engage in a fight in the first place, which, because of how easy a lot of the generic encounters were, ended up dragging the pace down a lot. In this case, I think it would have been better to keep the reward system focused on gold instead of other materials, as it might technically be more realistic to have those materials, but when the realism starts to make the game less engaging, I think it's time to take a step back and ask if that's really your first priority. The other thing that the game seems focused on addressing is the fact that, after a while, the really cool abilities end up losing their appeal due to how often they inevitably get spammed. Granted, it didn't come up often in the previous game, at least not until New Game Plus, but there's only so much one can up the ante before the really cool abilities start to lose their appeal. As a result, they put multiple limits on your ability to use elements, and place further restrictions as to when it's viable to use them. In principle, this isn't a bad idea, as it means you need to be more selective, and therefore allows the abilities to leave more of an impact. However, that endeavor is completely shattered by the fact that individual techniques are heavily downplayed, which means outside of aesthetic and stat differences between party members, there's little difference between a given element user and another. On top of that, you eventually build up so much space on your element grid that you can still spam the big guns on the relatively easy generic encounters, which, based on what I've already said, ended up being a slog. To continue with the theme, it seems like they were also trying to address problems that didn't really exist. For instance, the number of party members has ballooned out of proportion, to where we've gone from a tight-knit group to a deluge of random characters scattered all across the small region we find ourselves in. Each one has their own little point of interest in terms of the story, but there's only 3 unique techniques per character, one of which you have to find by completing a side objective, meaning it's easy for someone to get lost in the shuffle or neglected entirely, especially when they're, again, largely using the same abilities. So with all of that said, there's plenty that you can nail the combat for, as while it seems to want to be different, it ends up falling into a lot of the same traps that other JRPGs fall into. And yet, you might be surprised to hear me say that I actually do like the combat, broadly speaking. As mentioned earlier, the balance is fairly solid, save for the generic encounters being too easy, as the same tension that I liked from the original was carried over here. In the end, what won me over was one simple fact: the key fights made me think. Within the combat system, there are a lot of little tricks and eccentricities that force you to consider what's happening not just in the here and now, but also what you intend to do multiple moves ahead. In any given fight, I would be following a similar pattern, but I would also be considering the boss's attack pattern, considering when best to throw my more powerful elements into the field, along with all of the steps I need to take before then. There was more filler than killer for my liking, but when it was firing on all cylinders, the combat was excellent. In one case, I was up against someone who I daren't show to avoid spoilers, but in that fight, he was chaining together a series of elements that could one-shot my party leader. That meant I had to be very cautious as to how I approached him, through changing who had my revive elements ready to setting up the field so my party leader could still get a couple of good hits in before he went down, and so on and so forth. In that regard, it proved to be one of the more memorable fights in the game, though that's also due to another reason that will be discussed later. In another fight, I found myself against a powerful being who, in order to subdue quickly, I brought two characters who were innately effective with the opposing element. At first, I thought this would be a good idea, since their elements would have an easier time making a dent and causing all sorts of mayhem, but the reality was that every time I tried with that arrangement, I got pulverized. The characters were more than effective against this being, but they were also more susceptible when the big scary AoE elements were thrown down, meaning I kept repeatedly getting knocked over. After trying it a few times, my solution was to trade out one of those party members and replace him with someone who was the same innate element as my opponent. That meant, while they weren't as effective in terms of damage, it meant that I had someone there who could withstand this creature's powerful AoE spells, meaning she could then in turn keep everyone else alive. And beyond all of that, I'd be lying if I said the presentation didn't help a bit with the sense of tension underlying the combat. The graphics are sort of hit and miss with me, as while I recognize that they're better than most PlayStation-era games of the time, that doesn't mean they hold up well. Some of the artwork is really good and the pre-rendered cutscenes are good enough as far as I'm concerned, but in-game, the character models aren't all that impressive. Especially for large areas, there's enough detail to where they're technically serviceable, but not enough to where they're nice to look at. If they had doubled the pixel count or changed a few camera angles here and there, it might fix up most of the problems, but the former wasn't really possible back then, and the latter has its own set of problems, especially since the cinematography is about as good as you could hope for already. Honestly, if Square Enix weren't busy failing at Chrono Trigger ports, this is a game that might benefit from an HD remaster, though whether it would be appreciated or not is still a matter of debate. To get back on point, when I'm talking about the presentation, I mean the music, because holy crap, this soundtrack is awesome. If I'm not lazy while editing this, the boss fight track should be playing right now, and it does wonders to distinguish the key fights from the standard encounters. Sure, the standard combat music is good too, but when this track plays, you immediately know, okay, things just got serious, let's do this. There's just so much energy packed into it that it's hard to not get really into whatever's happening, even in cases where I got utterly destroyed and had to start over. In a more general sense, the music is always able to provide the perfect mood and atmosphere for whatever's going on, adding a surprisingly large amount to virtually every point in the game. In one case, they want to build up the sense that something terrible is about to happen, so they keep it simple, using what sound like church bells with maybe a little bit of ambience in the background. When they need something peaceful or relaxing, they have the exact track ready to put you at ease. And if you want a really bizarre example, take a guess as to where this track is used. If you guessed that this was for a tragic or somber moment, you would technically be correct, but if you haven't played the game, you'd be surprised to know that that somber moment was a boss fight. In fact, if you recall when I was talking about fights that forced me to think, this was the track that played over the first example, and the real reason why it was so memorable. Granted, the track started playing before the fight began and simply continued into it, but despite the fact that they played a somber track over a boss fight, I still bought it. Due to the setup beforehand and the nature of the fight itself, it was incredibly jarring to hear it continue, but also completely justified at the same time, and I have a great deal of respect for anyone who can subvert my expectations like that while still making it work. Before we go into the story discussion, there are a couple of other points I want to tackle pertaining to gameplay. Beyond just fighting everything that moves, you'll also need to do some degree of puzzle solving and exploration. The game hides a lot of interesting stuff all over the place, some of which may be necessary to progress, others which are mostly there to encourage you to explore. The puzzle solving is generally serviceable, as while it can be needlessly obtuse in places, it does a good job at breaking up the combat sections without being too obstructive in its own right. When it comes to actually moving through the world though, the technical limitations of both the graphics and the system they're running on end up causing problems. Transitions take about 3 times as long as they need to, making the game seem longer than it actually is, to say nothing as to how your characters don't move all that fast to begin with. For all the good that I'll say about the pacing of the story, the game as a whole tends to drag because of those problems, to where there were multiple times where I was mentally telling the game to just get on with it and let me get to the interesting part. And speaking of that interesting part, the story is both very foreign yet very familiar. Since we're not following the characters of the original, we're instead given another spiky-haired silent JRPG protagonist called Surge to run around with. He lives in a small fishing village in the El Nido archipelago, where it is believed these ancient and mysterious creatures called the Dragon Gods reside. For Surge, however, his concerns are primarily focused on what every teenage boy is interested in, trying to not be a total imbecile in front of the opposite gender. However, his concerns are forced to rapidly shift when a strange turn of events sends him to a world that appears similar to his own, but is clearly not the same. As a result, he finds himself wrapped up in matters concerning not merely the world and time he finds himself in, but all manner of other things which foretell all sorts of high-stakes adventures for the days to come. And that's about all I can say without spoiling literally everything. So instead of critiquing story points, I'll be focused more on the structure and general execution. The first point in that discussion is the fact that the story is incredibly complex. I'll admit that I had to do a decent amount of reading after the fact to fully piece together and understand what happened, and even then, either I've misunderstood a critical detail, or this game doesn't logically follow. Which is odd to me, because this is the first time that I've really run into a situation like this. That could say more about me than the game, depending on your outlook, but since that's the case, it's definitely worth mentioning. What's even stranger to me is that this game's predecessor was also pretty complex, though not necessarily to the same degree, but I never found myself having trouble keeping up. I think the difference here is that there were a lot more things that you could anchor onto. To start with, the original had a lot more time-hopping shenanigans, but each time period acted as a discrete breakpoint that you could latch onto. It gave you a general idea of what to expect, and could therefore reframe what's going on from that perspective. Here though, the inevitable subplots and deviations from the main story are all forced into the same little archipelago, which means the story could seem more disjointed or convoluted by virtue of how much it has to juggle at once. This is only further amplified by the fact that the number of party members has dramatically increased. With a small group, not only did you have more time to develop them as individuals, they could act as another anchor, a consistent voice and face that you can use as a reference point for the inevitable insanity. Here though, it's easy for characters to get lost in the shuffle, and therefore underdeveloped, which means that's a second anchor that's not going to be of any help. Before I bash the characters too much though, let me be clear that my beef is purely with the fact that there are too many party members, as while many of the characters are stereotypical and a decent number of them are underdeveloped, I genuinely do like them, and there are very few that could be written out of the story without serious consequences. And even in the cases where they're more stereotypical, they are, as in the previous game, so vibrant and expressive that you end up strangely respecting them. I just wish they hadn't had literally everyone with a pulse joining the party. It might mean more replayability if I ever come back to this game, but it doesn't feel good in the moment to think I might be missing out on something due to something as basic as my party arrangement. And to further complicate things, there isn't always a clear objective, or at least a clear reason for why you're doing something. With the original, it was very simple. Bad thing ruined future, go stop it by engaging in Dammit Barry-style time travel. Here though, the game starts in media res, where you're in a place that you have no reference for, with characters that you don't know, with a completely alien combat scheme, and overly dramatic music that almost ruined the boss fight music because of how out of place it was, all for the sake of setting up an admittedly awesome scene later on. I kind of wish they had done something a little different so that I wouldn't be completely lost before the game decided to start for real, but hey, more fun for everyone when you're confused as all hell, right? Oh, and in case it isn't obvious yet, that was sarcasm. Being confused is not fun unless I have something to latch onto, something which you didn't always give me. Besides that chicanery though, even after the story has picked itself back up, there wasn't always a strong sense of what you should do or where you should go. You had a couple of threads to follow up on, but I don't remember a clear reason as to why Serge would end up going down a certain path. Hell, I remember at one point he was asked whether he wanted to go home or not, and in that instance I couldn't help but ask, why wouldn't he? Whatever the bad guys are planning seems to hinge around his involvement, so if he took himself out of the equation by going out of reach, wouldn't that be a reasonable solution? Granted, this is a JRPG, so that would never happen, but the fact that that came up in my mind meant that either there was a lapse in motive, or my immersion was broken, neither of which are good signs. However, despite all the naysaying that I've engaged in thus far, I will give credit where credit is due. The story may be complex and incomprehensible, but the storytelling itself is excellent. Though not everything fits as neatly as you might like, the game does still have a good sense of timing, of knowing when to up the ante and when to dial it back and give us room to breathe. Following crucial information, we'll be given time to ponder the current events, often alongside a side quest pertaining to another character. When there is a clear direction for where to go, the game is really engaging, both due to the circumstances themselves and the anticipation of not quite knowing what's going to be thrown at you, of wanting to see how all of your predictions will end up shattered as a new piece of information completely shifts your perspective. And when push comes to shove, that's what I love the most about storytelling. That anticipation, of wanting to see what's behind the curtain, of trying to piece together everything and understanding how it all fits in. Even though there are plenty of holes I can poke into the story, as time travel is a fickle subject at the best of times, the crucial information is perfectly scattered about to where I was always interested in seeing what was around the bend. Overall, despite all of the negative stuff I've said, I'd be lying if I said I disliked the game. A lot of the changes that were made didn't necessarily work to its advantage, with the reward system being needlessly complicated, the story being nigh incomprehensible, and the deluge of party members leading to multiple characters feeling underdeveloped. And yet, the core reasons why I like Chrono Trigger are still intact, such as the sense of tension within the combat, the story that's consistently able to catch me by surprise and keep me guessing, and a really good soundtrack to glue it all together. I can definitely understand why people would say it's not a worthy successor to Chrono Trigger, as it's a very different beast that, on the surface, shares only the world in common. But if you want to tell me that Chrono Cross is a bad game, I'm afraid I'll have to disagree on that. It's a flawed gem, but it's a gem nonetheless, and one that I think is worth checking out. If only for one of you to help me figure out what the developers are smoking and telling me where I can get it. If you're interested, I'll let you figure out how to play a game that isn't being sold anymore, at least to my knowledge, and we'll leave a link to the emulator I used in the description below. It's not the most popular emulator out there, and I'm pretty sure it chopped the top and bottom of the screen off, but it was a lot easier to set up than the other ones I tried, and when you're dealing with PlayStation emulation, I'll definitely take convenience over other factors. Either way, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a usually weekly basis. And in case my content continues to not be weekly due to time constraints or outright laziness, be sure to hit notifications on the off chance that I both upload something and YouTube decides to actually let the system work as intended. And speaking of content, it has been way too long since I've done one of these, to the point where I forgot how much I enjoyed doing them. It's weird. You spend so much time away from something due to all manner of different reasons, and that time can end up reminding you of why you liked it in the first place. Although, it might be a while before I can get another review out, as this one took a while on its own because I was adjusting to a new job, and even once I've acclimated, I'll still have a lot less time to throw into video editing. It also doesn't help that all of the games on my shortlist are either long-winded, ones that I'm not interested in playing right now, or ones that I don't own yet, so if you have any suggestions for what I should look at, feel free to leave that alongside anything else you want to say in the comments below. For now, I better get back to work, so thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you all later.